So I'm actually not going to put up all of the charts and graphs because everyone said that we shouldn't do that. So I'm going to describe for you the employment situation rather than do it in charts and graphs. I'm going to tell you a couple of things about the employment situation of veterans broadly and about the unemployment rate of vets, specific populations, and some other things. But I'm going to set a little bit of context for you first. Everybody has seen information recently on the unemployment rate of veterans and of veterans with disabilities. Is it going up or is it going down? Does anybody know? Down. Depends on the ages. Depends on what service period you're looking at. Depends a little bit on what time period you're looking at. If you go back 10 years, you go back 6 months, 18 months, all of those kinds of things. So this is one of the challenges with data on veterans with disabilities and veterans without disabilities, is it depends on what you're looking at, and it depends how you're looking at the employment situation of veterans, whether it's getting better or worse, where it's getting better or worse, and understanding what those demographics are across the populations that you're specifically targeting is really an important component of it. If we look at all veterans of all ages, it is better, their unemployment rate is better than the unemployment rate of non-veterans. I'm a vet. I will tell you with absolute certainty that my time in the Air Force better prepared me for the workforce than anything I did in college or otherwise. And I think if we look at all veterans of all ages, they will probably uniformly say something like that this actually prepared them very well for the workforce. When we look at our business case for hiring a veteran, a document that Mike put together about a year ago, we look at all of the academically researched support for these theses that veterans make better employees. And we find that it is supported in all of the literature related to the all-volunteer force. Veterans have a lot to contribute to employers and to American competitiveness. And so employers are realizing this and have begun to hire them in more significant numbers, not because it's the right thing to do, but because it's the right thing to do for their business, for their competition, for their competitive status. If they don't hire somebody in a competitive situation, we'll hire. So all of those things become very, very important when you're looking at and understanding that. That all being said, the unemployment rate for our youngest veterans, the unemployment rate for our youngest enlisted veterans in particular, is higher than their non-veteran peers. Some have suggested that reasons for that include that this is a natural transition. I do think there's some truth to that. I do think there is a natural transition period, but I don't think that's all of it. I think that there are some systemic barriers. I think that there are some concerns. I think that there are some things that have happened very differently in this war than in past wars. I think multiple deployments have happened in a much different way in these wars than have happened in different wars. I think that we have relied differently on our Guard and Reserve components. And so there are a lot of things about the data here that we don't fully understand. For people with disabilities, we often talk about the unemployment rate in this country, and a lot of people who don't understand the terms extraordinarily well, unemployment rate versus in the labor force and in labor force participation, say that the unemployment rate of people with disabilities is about 70% in this country. The truth is that about 30% of people with disabilities are in the labor force, are actively seeking work, or are employed. That's not quite the same as it is in the veteran population, but interestingly, veterans with disabilities are unemployed at far lower rates than their peers who are non-veterans. And I think a lot of that goes to the fact that they have had careers in the military and they know that they can work, and the injury becomes a barrier that needs to be overcome, and that's something that veterans are using. It's also something that we'll talk about a little bit tomorrow in one of our panels. The idea that corporate America already understands how to hire people with disabilities because they've been required to do so by the ADA for over 20 years. And so there are a lot of lessons that we can learn from unemployment of veterans, unemployment of people with disabilities that we can apply into the veteran space. So there are a lot of things to learn, I think, in this meeting over the next couple of days. We have terrific civilian employers who are coming in and talking with us about it. We have folks who are in government and folks that are in the nonprofit sector, folks that are in the private sector. And I think that those collaborations are really, really a key to this. So I'm going to give you some numbers now that we've given a little bit of that context. We've got somewhere between 200 and 350,000 people a year separating from the military over the next 5 years because we're drawing down from Afghanistan in part and for other reasons as well. That's a total of about 1 million who will separate over the next 5 years. There are now a little over 20 million veterans in the United States overall. About 844,000 of those veterans are looking for work at any given time. right now, and about 252,000 of those are post 9/11 veterans. The 252,000 is out of about 2.5 to 3 million veterans. So there are a significant number of vets who have served post 9/11, between 2 and 3 million, and 250,000 or so of those are actually seeking employment. So there is a significant number of veterans who are available, and most of those veterans are going to have a variety of training that you can draw on. There are differences within this by age, and I'm going to talk about those in a minute as well. I'm going to talk a little bit about women veterans. One of the things that we know about women veterans right now is that there are about 1.8 million overall. 1.8 million overall female veterans, about 8% of the total population. Right now, they're about 14% of the active duty force and about 18% of the reservists. The average age is about 48 compared to about 62 for male vets, so they're younger than their counterparts. The post 9/11 cohort has about 150,000 women who have deployed to Iraq and Afghanistan, and of those, about 30,000 are single mothers. That has implications when we talk about veteran homelessness and what's happening in new veteran homelessness issues, who's becoming homeless, what the definition is of homelessness, and how they're being served. But employment is very tied to that, and disability is also tied to that, so that's an important component of it. The post 9/11 female veteran unemployment rate overall is about 15%, so it's significantly higher than their non-veteran counterparts, and in some age groups it's even higher, so that becomes really important as well. And thanks to joining forces for some of those numbers. That's their most recent shared out of the White House on many of those. When we look at veterans with disabilities and that the couple of million who have served since 9/11, we know that about 30% of them, conservatively estimated, have some sort of disability, according to some RAND studies that were recent. The numbers are estimated that it may be higher than that. We don't yet have a full grasp on it, and we won't really know until 30 to 40 years from now what those disability statistics really look like. That was one of the findings in Linda Bilmes' and Joe Stiglitz's work when they looked at the $1 trillion war, is that the cost of war goes up over 30 to 40 years, and the biggest reason for that is disability-related claims and how those will happen over 30 to 40 years. But conservatively right now, about 30% have some sort of a disability. Those disabilities include things like traumatic brain injury and post-traumatic stress, which are really considered the signature injuries of this war. But they also include things like loss of extremities, including hands, feet, limbs, genitalia. It also includes hearing and vision loss in some cases, and it includes burns. And so these are all the kinds of injuries which are necessary to understand how to accommodate. The good news is, again, some of our panelists who are here from the Job Accommodation Network and from companies who have been working with the U.S. Business Leadership Network and others over the last 20 to 30 years already understand many of the accommodations that can work for people with disabilities generically, and with some cultural competency can understand how to apply those accommodations into other settings. So by one of the numbers that we looked at, talking about significant numbers of traumatic brain injuries, let me compare that to the civilian population for a minute so you know the reference population. Although much of the advances are coming from research based on military injury, traumatic brain injury, and the VA's work in this area, much is also coming as a result of sports-related injuries and recreation-related traumatic brain injury. There are about 1.4 million traumatic brain injury-related deaths, hospitalizations, and emergency room visits each year right now outside of the military. So we have substantial expertise that we can apply to this. There are about 1.6 to 3.8 million sports and recreation-related TBIs each year, period. Those don't all result in those kinds of emergency issues or really significant issues. Again, very similar to what we're experiencing with mild traumatic brain injury and major traumatic brain injury or serious traumatic brain injury. We already know a lot about how to accommodate those, and we already understand why this is important in our country in the civilian side, because the direct medical costs and indirect costs, such as lost productivity from mild traumatic brain injuries, is about $12 billion in 2000. So we are already on the path to fixing some of those issues because of the fact that it impacts the civilian workforce. That's a really important component to know. Digging down a little bit deeper into the statistics of what's happening in the unemployment rates of veterans and non-veterans and different cohorts, we look at things like what is the unemployment rate in 2010, 2011, 2012, the most recent 3 years. And excuse me, over that period of time, we're actually seeing generally that Gulf War Era 1 and Gulf War Era 2 veteran unemployment rates are decreasing in the right way. Excuse me. Also, at that same time, the unemployment rate of all Americans is decreasing during that time. So from 2010 to 2012, for all Americans, including vets and non-veterans, it went from 9.4% unemployment to 8.7% unemployment to 7.8% unemployment. For all veterans, those rates were lower in every one of those categories. For 9.4 in 2010, it compared to 8.7 for veterans. For 8.7 in 2011, it compared to 8.3 in 2011. In 2012, all Americans were 7.8 and all veterans were 7. That's a good news story, right? Veterans are unemployed at rates lower than their non-veteran peers. However, when we dig a little bit deeper and we look at Gulf War II era veterans, in 2010, remember all Americans are 9.4%, but Gulf War era II veterans were at 11.5%. And in 2011, it went up and not down. It went to 12.1% in 2011, and then in 2012, it went down to 9.9. Thank you very much, Barbara. I appreciate it. Normally, I'm a Diet Coke person, and I've got one of those right here, and for whatever reason, I didn't bring mine to the table. So we see those changes in what's happening in that Gulf War II era. So it's still higher. That's not the whole story, though. The other important story is as we look at gaps between the non-veteran and veteran employment, over the past 10 years, the gap between them has been changing in a way that's not favorable, that shows that the non-veteran population is improving more now than the veteran population. So the gap between those is changing in the wrong direction. When we look at Gulf War I era veterans, World War II, Korea, Vietnam veterans, and other service periods, again, very similar. It's mostly the Gulf War II. Overall, when we're not accounting for age demographics and when we're not accounting for gender demographics or ethnicity. When we start to look at those, the picture changes significantly. So when I'm looking at the age 20 to 24 veterans, the youngest vets, probably the ones who only have a high school education for the most part, because if you're 22 and you have a college education, you're probably an officer, you're probably not going to transition out at that age, or you're going to have been wounded and very young without much experience. But for that particular cohort, it was 29.9% unemployment in 2011, and it was 20.6% unemployment in 2012. Comparing that to non-veterans, that same age, 20 to 24, it was 14.4 and 13.2. So there was a 15 percentage point difference between vets and non-veterans in the wrong direction there. And then in 2012, 13.2 versus 20.6%. So again, 7% difference in that 20 to 24. So one of the natural thoughts is, well, let's just get them into education, let's get them into some sort of employment experience, and they will grow into that employment rate that you want to see them grow into. And so we think that it will change. But when we dig into the numbers a little bit further, we find interestingly that the 25 to 29-year-olds are still unemployed at rates higher. In 2012, it was 12.9% versus 8.8%. 30 to 34-year-olds, same thing. 8.1% versus 7.6%. It isn't until you get to the 35 to 39-year-old that it's different. And that's about the mid-career level. 35 to 39, you're starting to hit your stride in the civilian world, but that's where your veteran experience seems to be catching up, right? And those experiences that you've had leading, that's probably the age when you're being assigned in a civilian company to have that sort of leadership experience that you already had when you were in the service. So maybe that's a reason that you're becoming unemployed at different rates. They think that you're at the level that you already were at 10 or 12 years ago, and they're giving you an opportunity. Could be the reason. When we get into other cohorts, though, again, the story begins to change. When we look at males who are Gulf War II vets versus males who are non-veterans, you see a difference between 9.4 and 7.6%. It's 2 points different. But when you jump over to females, 2012 numbers, 12.6% unemployment overall, as opposed to 7.3% unemployment for their non-veteran peers. So that's a 5 percentage point gap. We look at that in the Hispanic area, again, it's a couple of points higher. And when we start to begin to look at cohorts that are both age-based and gender-based and ethnicity-based, then we even see worse pictures in some cases. What we are seeing then is that Hispanic women who are 30 to 35, which is where most of the others are beginning to pick up some ground, they're unemployed at rates over 30%. We don't know why, but that's a significant challenge. They're still in the labor force because they're showing up in the unemployment numbers, but we don't understand that piece of it. When we look at African Americans, generally the story is better as opposed to their non-veteran counterparts. So again, that's an interesting component. When we look at females by age cohort, as you get up into the age range around 50 or so, you begin to see some significant differences. And some of those things are challenging for us to understand at this point. So I guess bottom line, what I'm saying is really important here to understand is where you are creating programs. You really need to understand the demographics of who you are reaching out to in any of your programs, in any of your services, in the regions that you're in, and design those program interventions to make sure that you have an in-depth understanding of what the demographics are, what the challenges are, what the barriers are, and that those barriers may be different as a component of education, as a component of ethnicity, of gender, of age, and of period of service. It may also be as important as when did they serve, and you may need to look at periods of unemployment. And we have some data which shows that periods of unemployment have varied. They actually seem to be getting a little bit longer now for the most current veterans than for earlier veterans as well. These annual averages, though, that I talked about, when we go back all the way to 2000, I'm just going to show you this chart, and I'm going to see if I can increase the size just so you can see it. This is probably the only chart that I actually wanted to show during this. So if you'll bear with me for 1 second, I will actually hold it up and show it. Because this is the one that I think is probably the most telling. These are the annual employment rates of Gulf War II, non-veterans, all veterans, and the charts here are sort of wavy but generally up except for the last 18 months. These pieces are important only in that this trend line here, the trend line that starts in 2000 goes from a bottom here to a top here, and I'll make this available. This is actually on our website. This is from our annual report of unemployment data, so it's available at our website for everybody. But that trend line has gone up over the last 10 years, and I think that that's an important thing to understand. As we are creating these interventions, we want to make sure that we are creating interventions that are going to start that trend line going back the other direction as well, and not only focus on the progress over the last 18 months, but also on why that progress over the last 18 months has happened. The other thing that I want to go to and talk a little bit about when we're talking about unemployment of veterans and the improvements that we've seen over the last 18 months is I want to talk a little bit about some of the private sector initiatives that maybe have contributed to this. When we look at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce's Hiring Our Heroes program, they're reporting that the companies who are affiliated with that have hired around somewhere over 100,000. They've got commitments to hire over 200,000, and they're reaching towards a 500,000 goal. When we look at the 100,000 jobs mission led by our colleagues at JP Morgan Chase and another 10 companies that founded it initially 18 months ago or so, and look at what they've accomplished now with 101 companies, they've hired 64,000 veterans that we can count tangibly over that 18-month period, including in the last quarter around 12,000, and in the quarter before that, when hiring typically picks up in the economy, about 23,000 veterans were hired during that period of time. Also looking at the joining forces commitments and looking at what the White House has done with many of their companies, they've reported over 125,000 hires as well. If you take those numbers, even deconflicting the fact that some people have overlapping numbers in those, that is probably responsible for almost the entire drop in unemployment rates, because if you add that up to that 200,000 or so, there's your couple of percentage points that have dropped over the last year. If we weren't doing those things in very concentrated efforts with our private sector partners and in conjunction with government, with the Department of Labor, with VA, with all of DOD's service branches, the new TAP and other kinds of things, we probably wouldn't have seen that decrease in the last 18 months. So it really is concentrated effort. And when you think about that, you're talking about 300 or so companies that have made this difference. 300 or so companies in a variety of coalitions that have really focused on this have dropped that unemployment rate a couple of percent. And so that's one of the things that we can look at to drop those employment rates by a couple of percent at a time. So that's really where we are in the unemployment data and understanding it. trending upwards, most recently a little bit down, but varying across all of the different demographics, including particularly Gulf War II women and various ethnicities, which are still at a higher rate and an elevated rate compared to where they should be. However, over time, reducing to a rate that should be lower than their non-veteran counterparts if history holds true. It remains to be seen whether history will hold true with this. This is, again, as I said, a different war, different numbers of people who have served, different percentages of the populations, different disconnections from the civilian population, as a report that was put out by our host, Pew, recently showed a very big gap between civilians and people who have served. So all of those things, I think, play into those as well. I'm going to stop at this point and ask if there are any questions. I'm also going to jump over to Mike, my boss, and ask if there's anything that he wants to add, but I'll start with your question.
Yeah, just clarification, the stats that you're given are based on
This is
veterans
BLS
that are
data.
actively seeking employment.
Yes, it's BLS data for our annual report. We also do some monthly reports. We issue a report on the first Friday of every month that's based on CPS data. All of those pieces, CPS, BLS data is based on their work that they publish. We get some of the unpublished data and share those, and those are all people who are actively in the workforce and seeking employment. Any other questions? Mike, anything that you want to add at all to this?
For somebody who wasn't going to talk about numbers, you talked about a lot of numbers. That was good. So I don't think
I wasn't going to put charts up. I was going to talk about numbers.
Yeah, I mean, the only thing I will say in the context of James talking about numbers is to highlight how important it is to really be careful with data. And what I mean by that is we can leverage data to tell a lot of different stories, and it's important to really think deeply about the insights conferred by the data and not get so. James mentioned we issue monthly unemployment reports based on the data collected by the Department of Labor. We do that because we want to inform the conversation. That said, month-to-month changes in unemployment as a consequence of that data, honestly, I don't believe personally as an academic, as a scientist, are all that valuable, because the sample sizes are very small. The results that you get can be influenced in some cases, depending on what segment of the population you're talking about, can be influenced dramatically by just one or two respondents. The annual report that James talked about actually uses a different data source, and so I'm much more comfortable talking about longitudinal trends than I am month-to-month changes in the data. But the reality is, as James pointed out, there is more to this challenge than simply a natural transition from military to civilian life. The challenge then becomes, how do we effectively relate military service in a way that's meaningful? You know, I'll share. I was going to say I'm not on camera because that pillar was in the way, but there's that camera staring me in the face. You know, I will share, for example, you know, we did have the opportunity to get some deeper insight into the data not too long ago by looking at unemployment claims filed by transitioning service members, something called UCX unemployment. And one of the interesting things from that data was that, you know, and this was Army-specific data, so it's not generalizable, and that's maybe to the other service branches, is 70+% of the unemployment challenge was explained by 3 military MOSs. Infantry, combat medic, and truck driver explained 70+% of all the unemployment challenges. We have to think about, to James's point, the programs that we run, the interventions. If the motivation is addressing the unemployment challenges facing vets, we have to tailor our programmatic interventions focused on who, in fact, is unemployed and struggling. Further, if you looked at that unemployment data, again, 70+% of those filing claims were in 3 military pay grades, E3, E4, and E5. 97% of all those filed claims were enlisted as opposed to officers. I share that, to my earlier point about when we design our programmatic interventions focused on unemployment, we really have to understand who it is we're trying to help. I think that has been one of the big takeaways. Not to take anything away from the service academy graduate who went out and got a master's degree after coming out of the military, they're going to be fine, The extent to which we need to, focus our inherently constrained resources on that population, I think they're going to be okay. It is the younger enlisted soldier, sailor, airman, Marine, that we have to focus on. And the last thing I'll say, you give me a microphone and I will talk and talk. Last thing I'll say, and I think this is also important, and this has gotten me in trouble in the past, so you're making progress when people get upset about what you say, so I'll say it again. We spend a lot of time talking about this whole idea of translating military skills to civilian life, and we've built translators to do this, and I truly think it is important that we consider how a young man or woman can build on the knowledge, skills, abilities, and experiences that they realize as a consequence of military service, but at the same time, we should not be locking them into a path where the universe of what's possible for them after the military somehow has to relate to what they did while they were in the military. One of the unfortunate realities that we've seen in the context of our work with employers is we have found many employers, not necessarily purposefully, but who are using these MOS translators as ways to disqualify people from jobs. You know what? If you don't fit in one of these, we were told that these 4 MOSs, AFSCs, whatever you want to call them, are the ones that are most closely aligned with the jobs we're trying to fill. And a stack of resumes on the desk, and if somebody doesn't have one of those MOSs, they don't even read beyond the MOS to look at the leadership ability, the military accomplishments that go beyond vocation, that could actually make that man or woman an invaluable employee at that company. From my perspective, the starting point has to be, you know what, kid, the world is your oyster. We have a post 9/11 GI Bill that will get you any kind of education that you need. We have goodwill in this country among the private sector focused on opening doors to a myriad of vocational opportunities. Just because you drove a truck in the Army doesn't necessarily mean that that's what you have to do in the civilian world. And our intervention should start with that conversation with that young man or woman. Tell us what you want to accomplish, and we'll design a path to get you there. And maybe that means you have to spend some time in school before you get to the job. But the point is, everything should be on the table. It should be the universe of what is possible rather than the mindset of what is probable as a consequence of what you happen to do in the military.
I think Mike must have been looking at the agenda, because those are the next 2 panel topics. When we go to those, what are the realistic expectations, and how do we overcome those? How do we avoid those labels and those assumptions? And we have exactly the key folks to talk about all those. But let me take one question first.
I don't think I heard any indication of kind of percentage of jobs that have of the people who have veterans who found jobs. What percentage of them have had disabilities, and if so, what the nature of those disabilities are?
So I did talk briefly about what the nature of the disabilities are: traumatic brain injury, post-traumatic stress.
The ones who got the job.
All of those have jobs, and it's an interesting component of it. I did not talk about those specific breakdowns. I do have those figures, but they're kind of small figures in terms of understanding what that sample size means. But I'd be glad to talk with you about that in specificity. What I will say now, though, is every single type of injury that our vets have been able to be accommodated. There is a little bit of definition there around severity level, and so some people who have the most severe traumatic brain injuries, for instance, may not ever be able to work again. There are most of the others, if you can still continue to think and communicate in some way, can be accommodated through technological advances and other kinds of things. But for the most part, if you can communicate in some way, if you can think in some way, you probably have the ability to contribute in some way to a society and to a job. So we can talk about some more specifics as we go. Yes.
Yeah, my name is Tony Forbes. I work in the Office of Warrior and Family Support on the Joint Staff. And just to talk to Mike's points, Mike, I also just want to say that there's some things that we're working on in terms of, I see the problem as being 50-50, meaning that we have to, the military, we have to look at and manage our service members in terms of setting them up for success as well. And that's a cultural change that needs to take place among all our leaders, and some things that we're addressing. I deal with it every day when I'm trying to explain to my peers in the building what our job and mission is, where a lot of us just believe, we look at it from a perspective of just saying our job is to fight and win the nation's wars. Well, I'll argue that from the minute we raise our hand, we're making veterans. So part of that is educating those young individuals and managing their expectations so when they do come out, to the civilian world and being caught and continue that transition or the reintegration. So the point I'm just trying to make is it is 50-50, and we are working at part of this as well and understanding that it's a cultural shift, a cultural change that we need to do within the DOD and the military itself.
Thanks. Absolutely agree with that.